Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Okay, everyone, thanks for coming. I'm always on the lookout for people to do our new book reviews, and Kara came to one of our book discussion groups we had last year, a couple years ago, on women's history, and we had another one on, I think it was American history, and Kara was one of our active participants, and I was thinking, oh, I gotta have her here to come talk about a book, so I was waiting for the right book. I'm glad we have a couple kids coming. Kara told me to put in a review. Mothers and Children Welcome, so we have a couple. So Kara is a teacher. She used to teach a master's degree in reading. She used to teach, and she's currently stopped teaching 5 years ago, so she's had to say she's halfway through her own 10-year nap. So the novel's called The 10-Year Nap by Meg Wolitzer, so here's Kara Rhode.
Thank you.
All right, there we go.
He stole my joke.
Oh, did I?
I was going to say that I was going to thank him for waking me up today to bring me out here and talk for a little while. But as Joe said, my name's Kara Rhode. I have two children. They're 4 and 20 months. Previously, I have been a teacher. I have a master's degree in reading from the University of Albany, and I taught for 5 years before deciding to stay home with our two children. I taught first grade, second grade, third grade, and fifth grade. And prior to that, just worked a lot with children in the inner city. I went to school outside of Philadelphia, so I've had some urban experience, and most recently it's been some suburban and even a little rural. So I'm really happy to be here today, and thank Joe for inviting me to come. And so the book I'll be reviewing is The 10-Year Nap by Meg Wolitzer. I don't know, has anyone read the book? A little bit? You're almost through it? Okay. I just finished it recently too, so that's not a bad thing, I'll admit. And I have to say, Joe I'm in here a lot with my own children, and Joe, every time he'd see me, so what do you think? So what do you think? So what do you think? And at first, I wasn't thinking the greatest of things, but even just today, kind of just talking through things with my husband, just to kind of go over what I was thinking, I realized now I actually really do like the book. I think it brought up a lot of really interesting things to think about as a society, to think about not only as women and mothers, but also as men and fathers, and it kind of lets us take a little bit of a look into some women's lives. And again, it gives us a very honest look into their lives because, as a reader, we can pull away and kind of look at it, and there's not any personal, emotional attachments to these women. You can kind of look at their lives and say, oh, that's interesting, or I wouldn't do that, but it's not like you're critiquing your friend, which I'll talk about a little bit too, that it can be hard. But I come from a family where my mom stayed home for the most part. She is a physical therapist. She's still working. She took a break when we were younger and worked a little bit part-time, and my grandmother actually would watch us once in a while. I didn't know my mom's mom. She passed away before I was born, and the only grandmother I've known also stayed home. My dad's mom stayed home with her children. She was one of 13 from a coal mining town in Virginia, so she's got some great stories. She worked a little bit when the Women to Work movement, she fixed fighter jet radios during World War II, and then once she had children, she stayed home and didn't go back to work until her kids were in college. And at that point, they just kind of enjoyed the extra money, was what she would tell me. But she never kind of felt that she necessarily had to go back to work. So this book really brought up a lot of really good questions, I think, a lot of good things to discuss. And before I start, I just kind of want to give you kind of my thoughts about motherhood, and so you kind of know what my perspective was going into reading this book. So a little bit about me. I always knew when I was a little girl that I wanted to be a teacher because I thought it would be a good job just to be able to stay home and also have a family and have children. Well, I've come to learn that that's a little naive. Just that teaching, my husband's a teacher as well, and that it's a lot of work, and most jobs are a lot of work, but it's a job that requires a certain energy, and working with young children, and then having young children, and then working with young children, you're kind of like surrounded at all moments, but that's okay. So once we got married, we kind of knew that when we decided to have children, that we wanted somebody to be able to stay home. And we were in a situation where, at the time, I was making more money because he was still finishing his master's, and I kind of had the job that was making more money. And luckily for me, that kind of switched. He got a permanent job too, so I could then have the choice whether or not I wanted who got to be the one to stay home, and I was the one picked, or I chose it. I'm not quite sure what that was, but we really wanted a parent to be able to raise our children, so we kind of set up our life so that could be possible. We live in Colonie. We have a pretty small house. It's actually the same builder who built my grandmother's house that she raised 3 children in, built our house. So it's a post-war salt box. I'm sure some of you know the style. And I asked my grandmother one day, I said, "Grandma, how did you raise 3 kids in a small house?" She goes, "Honey, I never really thought about it." And it just kind of shows you the shift in thinking. And I was like, "Well, where did you put their toys?" "Well, they had a toy box." A toy box? It just kind of, a very different generational thought, and I've come to really appreciate that. So I'm working on a toy box, which hasn't happened yet, but we're working on it. And I also feel privileged enough to be a part of an occupation that is obviously, it's primarily women still, and a lot of women have made the choice that I've made a choice. They taught for a few years and then stayed home to raise their families, and then eventually went back to work, which teaching allows that. I think there's kind of that grace there. Even the assistant superintendent of Averill Park Schools stayed home with her girls and went back probably anywhere from 10 to 15 years later, and came back to a profession that valued the time she spent away from home, which I feel fortunate enough to do that. Because one of the things that we'll find out in a little bit about the book is that not all professions are that welcoming, or not all professions set it up so that women can go back to work and feel like what time they've spent at home is valued in the workplace still. So I think that's one of the things that the book definitely talks about. The other thing I just felt was important is that I wanted my kids to have the best of me, and I wasn't sure that I could do both well. And I think that's a very personal decision, and some moms I think can do it very well, and other moms kind of know themselves. Even this week with getting ready for the book talk, and I started an after-school enrichment on Monday, and I felt like a crazy woman. And I was like, moms who work, parents who work, I think it's a very amazing thing when people can do both, and when people really try to do both well. And I think single moms, or moms that don't have the choice, who do it, are definitely have my applause for what they do. I think too, as a teacher, I also realize how important a parenting role is in the life of a child, because there's definitely children who have walked into my classroom who haven't had the most wonderful supportive family life. And not that every child's going to, but I think if you can give that to your child, if you can give them a home and a parent who is supportive, or a really great care situation, that you're really setting that child up for life. What they get in their first 5 years, just even scientific research shows that it really kind of sets them up for the rest of their life. The nurture they get, the care, the attachment helps brain function, which still to this day shocks me. That the simple thing as touch to a newborn, that it fires off all the sensors in their brain and actually helps their brain function, and actually helps them help them become a whole person. So I just really feel like that parenting is probably, being a mom is going to be the most wonderful thing I ever get to do with my life. And I don't get to do it for my whole life, because once, what age do they stop listening to? I don't know. 4-year-old, we're still doing pretty good. She's still listening to me. But so there's a certain age, I'm sure, that, you start, your role switches. You're not that primary caregiver as much anymore, and your role changes. So for right now, I'm very happy with my role. I think it's a great privilege to be the parent, the mother of 2 really, really sweet kids. And I'm very happy with the decision that we made. The book, the 10-year nap, I've teased Joe many times about, the title of this book, thank you for waking me up. I thought about having a bed on the side that I could actually be sleeping in, and when he came, he could wake me up. But, my husband vetoed all those ideas before I got to share them with Joe. But the concept of napping, or talking about motherhood as a 10-year nap, really, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to take a nap when there's small children around. Anybody? Not very relaxing. It's very unpredictable. You never know how you're going to get woken up, when you're going to be woken up, and it's very rare that I take a nap these days that I feel rejuvenated from. I usually get woken up by, mommy this or the phone, or so I thought it's kind of funny that they call it a 10-year nap. And actually, I read an interview with the author last night online, and she actually kind of wrote that to be kind of a little bit of a poke. And just that at the beginning of writing this book, she was looking at motherhood like a nap, like you're taking a nap from society, you're taking a nap from the workplace, that you're spending this time with your children that has been equated to napping. It's like, wow, that kind of hurts a little bit, But so I think it's kind of ironic that kind of in this post-feminist movement, because one of the things the book dives a little bit into is that one of the main characters' mother was really involved in the feminist movement in Canada, and kind of her experiences with that mother, I'll talk a little bit about more later. But it's just kind of funny that, the feminist movement was, going to bring all these wonderful things to women. And what I think some of the consequence of that has been is that how it now kind of views mothers and how it kind of views the role of being a mom. Or in that, I don't want to neglect fathers from that too, but it kind of, even in a sense, kind of takes away the importance of parenting from, at least that's one of the things that I picked out. But so the women in this book have now been out of work for 10 years. So the other day I was just thinking about, what did I do in the decade before I had children? So I don't know, how many of you in the room have children or grandchildren or, okay, some of you do. And so what did that decade before children look like? For me it was college, for me it was getting married, for me it was traveling, it was having money, it was saving money, it was buying a new car, it was all these going out to dinner like maybe 2 nights a week if we wanted to. And then the decade now of having children has very much shifted. Now I'm at home. I don't go out to dinner as much. I'm not going to be able to buy a new car right now. But there's a lot of things that have really shifted. And I was at the crossings talking on my phone to a friend of mine, and I was having a bad mom day, feeling like, my life was falling apart and complaining and crying or something. And my friend just said to me, she goes, look at how much your life has changed in just these past 5 years. And it's an adjustment. It's an adjustment period from, having financial freedom to feeling like I went to a job, and I did love teaching. So I didn't leave a job that I was like, oh, thank God, I don't ever have to go back to that place again. I really thought, wow, I'm missing out on something because I really love teaching, and I feel like it brings out the best parts of me. I feel like I get to use all the talents that I've been given in a classroom setting, and luckily that has translated to being at home as well. Like I feel like I'm a good mom. I do feel like I'm a good mom. I hope I am. And then there's you have adult interaction. You have people commenting on your day. You have people validating what you're doing. You have people giving you feedback, whether it's negative or positive. There's somebody there doing it. And one of the interesting things that the author talks about is how, as a mother, as a parent, as anybody who stays home with children, that a lot of your day is unseen. It's not commented on. There isn't somebody giving you assurance or saying, wow, you handled that tantrum really good today. Bravo to you that it did not go to complete meltdown level. Like, you don't have somebody doing that. And sometimes you have the validation of your children. They end up pulling themselves together and putting on the right shoes. This was yesterday. We had meltdown over white shoes because, they were too small and not, fall appropriate. But, nobody's there to kind of say that to you. Say, wow, you handled that great. And that's one of the things that I feel like sometimes is lost and is hard about being a stay-at-home mom. And that we also kind of don't always take into consideration how really important those attachment things are, and how important it is for children to feel attached and to feel like they have this very nurturing, loving environment. But I think Meg Wolitzer was trying to say a few things. And if anything, at first I was going to tell you that I didn't really like this book. And I didn't think it was like the greatest writing, but what I did really like about it, I mean, I've recently read like The Red Tent, The Kite Runner, The Namesake, kind of these very literary, beautifully written books. And so this wasn't quite as beautifully written, but what I think what it did do is it really gave a lot of good talking points, and it really made me think about our culture and the state of being a parent in this country, and kind of different things that I feel pull on me anyway. I think that it really brought some things out, so that's what I want to talk about. But I think she really gave us some really good conversation starters, and that she really talks about how complex motherhood is, and really how complex being a woman can be. And really just talks about the complexity of life, that there are really no easy answers. We all kind of know that from one situation, that there's no Band-Aid that can fix everything, and that not every situation is right for everyone. So that deciding to stay home or deciding to work is a very personal decision. And that I think some people go into it with really good intentions, kind of look at their life and say, well, I feel like what we tried to do is say, like, what are we going to have to do here so that we can do this? So that one of us can stay home, what is our life going to have to look like? And I think that, some people enter it that way, and some people just say, oh, we'll figure it out as we go along, which is fine. Some people work that way. But I know for me that that's not the way I necessarily work. But she really, I think what she gives us a glimpse into these women's lives to show us that there's always two sides to every story. There's nothing that's going to be right for everyone. And that when you look at it, that our lives are really intermingled. That one person's life, that we don't live as separate as we think we do. You know, our American culture sometimes has us believe that, you stay in your house. You don't, not a lot of houses have front porches anymore, which I think, or sidewalks leading to your front door, which it's hard because years ago, that's the way neighborhoods were built. Neighborhoods were built so that communities would come together, and that one person would walk to the other person's house, and things are set up differently now. So even as a culture, we're not really creating an environment that is supportive and nurturing to families. It's very different, I feel. But she gives us a look into 4 women's lives. There's Amy. She is a corporate lawyer. Jill, a film producer. Any Roberta. She is a professional artist. And Karen is a banker. And my husband thought it'd be funny to see if are there any lawyers in the crowd? Film producers? Artists? Kind of, a little bit. Bankers? Okay, and it's funny that she actually sets the book in Manhattan and gives these women very high-powered jobs to make this book, one, very believable, that you could see the struggle, and that Manhattan has such an environment of, the epitome of the American work ethic, that this would be such a struggle for them that it makes you kind of be able to step back and really believe it, and that it was set in Manhattan, and that all the women's husbands can provide a life so that they don't have to work. So it was never it didn't have to be like do we need the extra $500 a week, or can we get by on your paycheck? So she said it in Manhattan, so we kind of wouldn't have to think about those things, so we could just focus on the women, which I think was very interesting. And she really did that on purpose. And she writes the husbands as generally really nice guys, so we don't have to question their characters about who they picked. We don't have to debate, well, her husband was really, we don't have to debate that. We can just read the women and look at their struggles, which I appreciated because he didn't give you a lot of sidebars that you had to kind of give your attention to. You could just kind of read the women and see what their perspectives were. And then they didn't talk too much about the kids. There was one child that they talked about, a little girl named Nadia, that we'll talk about a little bit later too. But for the most part, they really just kind of let the kids be the kids and really just focused on the mothers. So from these mothers, we can see that women have a lot on their minds, that given the right time, the right venues, the right friendships, the right outlets, that there's a lot to talk about and a lot can be learned. I even said a new book review. This is a good place to talk about these things. And that women's thoughts can come together, and that, all of our thoughts can help us come together, but that it really kind of, looking at their lives, kind of gives us a glimpse into society and kind of gives us time to think. that's what reading this book did for me. It really gave me some things to think about, some things to mull over, and that is one of the things I really appreciated it. So I'm going to look at the mothers. This is kind of how I chose to do this, kind of to look at each of the moms and then kind of talk about what I think some of the things the author could have been trying to teach us or give us things to think about through each of their lives. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Amy, and she was kind of the main character of the book. And she was a lawyer, and her husband met when they were both lawyers at a firm in New York City. And she initially was just going to stay home for this allotted 6 weeks. Well, the 6 weeks turned into 12 weeks. The 12 weeks turned into a year. The year turned into 10 years. And now she's kind of at this point where she's looking at her life going, and what have I done? And the author spends the first 40 pages of the book with Amy wondering what she's done and trying to get her 10-year-old out of bed. So that was one of my first things with the book. I kind of went, okay, it's taking way too long to get him out of bed. Just go wake him up. He's not going to hear you across your 2,000-foot Manhattan apartment. Like, you need to go physically take him out of the bed. But that's just, one of those things that I thought a little about. But Amy, what kind of her reflection throughout the book kind of shows us, like, one, how much women have on their mind when they're home, when they're doing lots of things. I think that's what that first 40 pages of probably what was maybe a 5-minute trying to get her son out of bed, just all the things that were on her mind for 40 pages. I think I could fill a 40-page book in 5 minutes if I sat down and wrote down all my thoughts. There's times when my husband comes home where I just don't stop, and then this and this, and he just kind of, luckily he's a really good sport, and he's a good guy, and he listens, and actually, responds to me when I do this. So I feel very fortunate in that way, and that she kind of shows us that women need a place to be heard, whether it's with other women, with other mothers, with their husbands, how important that relationship is, that you need a supportive partner who is willing to listen to you and is willing to be there for you and is willing to support your stay-at-homeness, I guess we'll call it. And that mothers need validation. Mothers need someone to say every once in a while, wow, you did really well there. There's a scene in the book where Amy's at a museum and she's talking to her son about realism, and she's thinking, people are going to think I'm insane. I'm talking to my 5-year-old about realism, but he actually understood her. And she's wondering if that said something about him, whether he was on the spectrum or the autism spectrum, but she realized that he's just an interesting, smart child. But an older woman comes over and says to her, wow, that was such a sweet interaction between you and your son. And just what she took away from that, someone saw what I did today. And I had a moment recently at the doctor's office where I had, my husband actually came with me to the doctor for both of our kids' checkups. And as the nurse was leaving, I said, the last time we did shots, you didn't hold my daughter down. You let her sit in my lap, and it really worked well. And I just want to make sure we can do that again. And she was like, oh, okay, yeah, we can do that. And then Brian turned to me and said, he goes, you're such a good advocate for our children. And I just burst into tears. I was like, I am. It was just you forget until someone sees it and someone comments, and then you're like, wow, I did something right. Because normally when you have little children, not always telling you do things right or arguing with you don't always feel that way. So just that validity is really important. And then just it's validity, and then just needing feedback. And that she also kind of shows us that sometimes that you need to be able to do something that's outside of yourself, and that kind of focusing so much on yourself and what you're doing at home, sometimes that can be a little bit hard. And so sometimes you need something outside of yourself to focus on, or a project. And in Amy's case, the project was another mother, which didn't end up very well. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. But I always get teased that I rearrange my house all the time. My mother-in-law says someday I'm going to come and your bedroom's going to be in your kitchen, because there's no other configurations you can use. But it's because sometimes I don't know what to do with that time, so I rearrange my house, or I think of a project that involves rearranging my house. And I said to Brian one day, I said, you know what? Because sometimes he'll definitely get frustrated, be like, are you not satisfied? What are you trying to do here? And my response is, this is my work environment. So just as you rearrange your classroom, I rearrange our house because this is my work environment, and sometimes this helps me with my work, or at least helps me get my mind off my work for a little while, and I can concentrate on, furniture rearrangement or whatever it is. So, and she kind of poses the question too, like, is it enough to just be a mom? Is that enough? Like, do you have to have something else? Can you just be a mom and be happy that you're a mom and not feel like you always have to be looking for something else to do or for something else to fill your time? Like, is being a mom enough? So the other thing that Amy's life helps us look at is how do you stay current in an ever-changing career? So she was a lawyer, and she went on an interview a little bit after her son was born, and like 2 years later, and they were asking her about a legal software that she had never heard of, had no idea how to use, and she felt completely irrelevant and didn't go on another interview. Because she thought, if it's changed this much in 2 years, what does it change like? What will the change be like now in 5 years, and now she's at 10 years? What is it going to look like, and how do I stay relevant if I do want to go back to work? So I think that that's something that's hard, because when you're taking care of small children, sometimes it's hard to imagine doing anything else, much less keeping up on legal software, or whether it's, for me, it's reading the next educational text that comes out. And I'm fortunate enough to have my husband who also loves to talk, so I hear a lot about his day, and I kind of know what's going on. So I don't feel like, I feel like if I decide to go back to work, I'm not going to have that issue. But that for some women, this is a really, really hard thing, because that time that you spend at home isn't necessarily always seen as valuable. And if you haven't been keeping yourself in somehow, people are kind of look at you like, well, so what have you been doing? and it's a hard thing to put into words sometimes, what you have been doing. I wrote it down one day. I wrote down all the things I had been doing just because I kind of wanted to know, and I was like, I did a lot. I managed our finances, I got us, I did a really good job grocery shopping. I mean, all these things seem trivial, but there's cognitive things involved in all these things. And then she also, it's interesting, her mother was the feminist. So she was brought up by a mother who at one point decided that she needed to take care of herself first, and that the children could take care of themselves, but she needed to take care of herself. So she started locking herself in an office and writing historical fiction, and said to the girls, she had 3 daughters, do not interrupt me unless it is an absolute life or death emergency. So these 3 girls really ended up raising themselves. And so she kind of helps us look at and say, like, what has your own mothering experiences taught you, and how has it made, what kind of mother has that made you? So it seems to a certain degree that she almost went in the opposite extreme. She had a mother who kind of said work, it was very obvious that work was more important. So she decided to kind of go, well, work's not going to be the most important. My child, she had 1 child, but he's going to be the most important. So it's like, what are you fighting, or what are you accepting from your own mothering experiences? And it's interesting in her situation too. Her dad, actually, there's a little bit of dialogue about her father, Mr. Lamb, Mrs. and Mr. Lamb. They're Canadian. And he expresses, he comes home one day early from work and is watching the girls play out Jane Eyre, and is just very silently watching his children and really feeling like he missed out on so much of their growing up. And if it would have been a different decade, I think he would have been the one who would have stayed home, and his wife would have been the one to work. So in what situations that there's some women who the working thing is what they do well, and for some fathers, the staying home thing is something they do well. So they kind of flirt with that a little bit, that might have been something that he would have liked. So it kind of poses that question, like, where do fathers fit into this too? Like, sometimes women should be the ones working, or in that family that works for them, and the fathers are more suited to be at home. So she talks about that. And the other interesting thing too is that she talks a little bit about are there other things that you can think about besides being a mom? Can you still use your brain? Which I think, I'll read a little passage from the book. It says, certainly you could also focus the thick, keen lens of your intellect on the greater world if you wanted. You could anguish over the war that ground on far away on another continent, and Amy did dwell on this periodically, hopelessly during the day. But you would have to do this on your own time, between plans. You were the gatekeeper and nerve center and the pulsing, chugging heart of your family. the one whom everyone came to and needed things from. You were the one who had to coax the unconscious child from his bed day upon day, which I think is interesting, but kind of gives you that thought, like, there's other things that you can think about and that you want to think about, but when do you get the time to think about them? And kind of that, I think what the author was trying to say is that you need to find that time. If you want to think about other things, that you need to find the time to do that. So we'll move on to Jill. She was a film producer, and she lived in Manhattan for many years, and then when they decided to finally, they had some infertility issues. So it took them a longer time to have a family, and they eventually ended up adopting a little girl from Russia, from Siberia in Russia. And she was a film producer, and once they decided to have the little girl, to adopt the little girl, they moved to the suburbs. So she is the token suburban mom in this situation. And her story kind of tells us what happens when you, as a mother, lose focus or kind of are not sure what to focus on. She, in high school, went to a very prestigious all-girls school and was the recipient of the Vivian Swoop Award. And the Vivian Swoop Award was given to the girl with the most promise. And it's an interesting contrast to, she went back for a reunion of all the Vivian Swoop Award winners, and when she was asked what she did, she told everybody, well, I'm a shadow parent. And what that meant for her, the little girl that they adopted ended up having some learning difficulties. And so they called the teacher who worked with her a shadow teacher, just who was there to help her out. And so she kind of felt like her role had become a shadow parent, that she was just kind of there to help her child along. And this character helps us see, like, is motherhood for everyone? Is being at home for everyone? And does motherhood help you reach your fullest potential? And in this situation with Jill, I thought, her husband was very attached to this little girl, and she really wasn't. And it kind of gives us this very honest look at what happens when mothers don't attach to their children, because not every mom feels like warm fuzzies towards their kids. It's just a fact. And it's not a fact we like to think about, and it's not a fact we like to read about, but it's a fact. And it's interesting because, they adopted this little girl a little bit before she was 2 years old from an orphanage in Russia, where she wasn't given those extremely loving, nurturing experiences from a very young age. So that kind of helps us look at that a little bit too. Like, Nadia represents this little girl who kind of wasn't given what she needed. So in her situation, that has led to her having some learning difficulties. Like, they keep calling them learning difficulties, which is very hard for me as a teacher because they handled all that very wrong. But, I'm not the one in New Jersey doing that. But she helps us see, is motherhood for everyone? Do all women feel maternal instincts? Because not all women do. And is it okay to admit that maybe you don't? Which she never really talked to any of her friends about the feelings that she was having. She's feeling like she couldn't attach, that every time her daughter talked to her, she almost just wanted her to be quiet. And it kind of gives this very honest look at that sometimes that is how people feel. And that that has to be okay, at least to be able to talk about it so that you can work through it. Because through different circumstances, this little girl would always sing the same song over and over again. It was kind of a very melancholy tune, and they assumed it was a lullaby from Russia. Ended up being Rice Rhode, the San Francisco treat, but in a different key. She'd actually had transposed it, which is a really, really high functioning skill. So kind of through, and they happened to be at a music school for another child's piano lesson, and the Russian voice teacher overheard her singing and said, she transposed that, and she is singing Rice Rhode, and she sings beautifully. Can I have her be one of my students? And so this little girl kind of got pulled into this other world, and then her mom and dad are sitting at a recital listening to her sing, holding hands, and it was kind of a moment they needed to attach to their child. And it just was really interesting to me, but that little girl kind of represents sometimes what can happen when children don't get the love and nurture that they need. And the mom kind of gives this picture of what happens when you don't necessarily attach to a child, and how do you get there? And when they finally started getting some help for their daughter, the mother started to come around and feel like she could also do this. And the interesting thing about Jill is that Jill's mom, was very briefly on Broadway and was a very melancholy person who actually in the end ended up taking her own life. And think about how much that affected Jill, growing up with a mother who she knew had been very melancholy. And then at some point, her mother didn't think she could do it anymore, and then ended up taking her own life. And then how that affected Jill and how that affected her own views of motherhood, or what they were like. So Jill was, a very kind of a little bit of a dark character, a little bit of a person who you kind of were pulling for. You hope she kind of figured it out. And I think towards the end she made peace with herself that she was going to be home and that her daughter needed her, and that was kind of what was going to give her life purpose, was that this little girl needed a lot, and so her mom was going to be able to give it to her. But it's something that's interesting that the author chose to call her a shadow parent, because when you think about someone who's in a shadow, they're not seen, they're not heard, So that was kind of her role, and not kind of, she wasn't seen, she wasn't heard, and that she was kind of in the shadows of her daughter's life. The next woman was Roberta. She was a painter. Her parents were crafters. They would make those like St. Patrick's Day paper mache type things in bulk, like mass productions of centerpieces, which is they actually made a really decent amount of money doing it and made a good investment in the 70s, bought an apartment in Manhattan that they later gave to their daughter and her husband. And her husband was a very interesting character. He was a puppeteer, which is kind of funny how they talk about him as a puppeteer. I don't know any puppeteers, but there's obviously this subculture of puppeteering that is really intense. And Roberta and her husband did a little bit of puppeteering in their days, and she never quite made it as an artist. And when they started having children, she stopped painting. She decided that what she would make assisting the puppeteering and what she would make and what she would have to pay in childcare canceled each other out. So why were you going to get someone to, take care of your children if you could do it? It kind of, they canceled each other out. But Roberta, I think one of the things that she really wants us to think about is that as moms, like, to try not to give up on your life's passions, because if you kind of give up on the things that kind of are what made you in the first place, that can be a really hard path to go down, because they had a really small apartment and she was trying to do some painting, and little by little it just kept dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. And when they finally were able to move, they moved to Harlem. Her husband, who didn't give up on his dream of puppeteering, he was a news anchorman, not an anchorman, a cameraman. And one day the head of the network just saw him doing a little bit with his puppets and snagged him, brought him down to the children's department or whatever it's called, and brought him down there, and they syndicated a show of his puppets that became extremely popular, and they were able to move and buy a place in Harlem, and now they had this big house with lots of space, an art studio. Everybody was doing what they loved except for the mom, Roberta. She wasn't doing what she loved. She had a beautiful studio, and she couldn't find it in her to paint. So she kind of lost that. So I think her life kind of helps us see, if you have a passion, that try to find a way to do it. And even for her, like she said, she used to love doing crafts with her kids, but that wasn't cutting it. Like gluing was not the same as painting. And I can understand that. I did an enrichment thing over the summer at Hudson Valley, and I thought it would be like a little bit of that teaching buzz, but it actually ended up being more like glorified camp counselor. So it didn't quite fire off the synapses I was hoping it would, and it didn't quite give me that little bit of teaching that I was hoping it would. So I think she really is encouraging, the author, just to say, keep after your passions. If you have something you're passionate about, it'll make you even a better mom. It can even make you a better mom if you're doing what you love. Your kids see you doing what you love. It'll help them see that it's important to take care of themselves. So, and that it's also hard to watch your husband do something that he loves and then be really successful at it. And sometimes it's hard for me because Brian and I share the same occupation. So there's days that he comes home and I'm like, you stole it from me. You took my occupation, which he really didn't. But I feel like you did sometimes. But just in how you have to come to peace with that for yourself so that you're not, and she did eventually. She realized, this is his thing. He went after this. I didn't keep doing it. I gave up. And she kind of reconciles in herself that he did this, he felt good, and that she needed to find something else because she couldn't just go along with him to feel good. The last woman, second to last woman, is a woman named Karen. Now, Karen is the one who probably appears the least frequently in the book. Karen is a banker. She has 2 kids, a very supportive husband, and she goes to bed reciting like number frequencies at night. So it's funny because she kind of still does a little bit of it here and there. She, even if it's at night, reciting numbers in her head. With the math part, math is not my subject, so when they were talking about pi, and I just kind of skipped over that part because I was a little bit lost. But what she goes on interviews, though, which is really interesting. She gets on her power suit, which are very expensive, I can gather, because the designers, I didn't know who they were. So she puts on her power suits, and she goes to interviews, and every interview she goes on, they offer her a job, because she's so good at what she does. And every interview she turns down. And she has the luxury of the end, she kind of towards the end of the book, she realizes that she's going to wait till she feels like it's the right fit, till she is excited by something. So she's waiting to feel inspired, which I think, give her a lot of credit for that, to just keep trying, to keep putting yourself out there. But she is really decided that she's going to wait for when the job is right for her. Even though her kids, are older now, they don't need her as intensely as they did before, that she has the ability to go and say, oh, no, this one doesn't feel right, and that she can go back. But I think it's interesting that she does that, and that she's very comfortable with her life out of any of the characters, and I think maybe this was why there wasn't as much time spent on her, that she's very comfortable with her life. She's very content as a mom. She is very proud of the fact that her husband can afford their lifestyle. Her parents are very proud of the fact that her husband can afford her lifestyle. She grew up in San Francisco in a small area where her parents were both cooked at a Chinese restaurant. And she'd come home and she'd be in her bedroom doing math. And her mother would say, come out here and take your vitamins and stop doing your math. You need to work. You need to work hard. I want to see your hands fly making dumplings. And she kind of just kept with her love of numbers. But her parents are very proud of the fact that their daughter doesn't have to work, that her husband can support her. And their life, out of all 4 of the women, seems to be the one that you kind of go, that doesn't seem so bad. Like, she's kind of reconciled herself. I could do that. I could put on a suit and go on interviews and not take jobs. Maybe I could do that. And she's very comfortable. She seems, out of all of them, to kind of have reconciled herself and seems the most comfortable with her life. And then they throw in this other character of Penny. And Penny, if you can imagine her in your head, is the mom who you think has it all together. She's blonde, of course, and perfect, and in really great shape, and has a really great job, and really great kids, and a really high-powered husband who makes a ton of money, has a really great nanny. And you kind of look at her life, and the way they write her, you just think, wow, she has it all together. But the first thing I kind of wrote in my book, having to tell my daughter today why she wasn't allowed to write in books was fun. But I kind of wrote in the sideline just like, okay, something's got to give. Like, they didn't write her in here to have this appearance of perfect, and there's something that has to give. Like, nobody's life is this perfect, and of course her life isn't that perfect. We find out that later on she's having an affair, and that her husband really isn't the greatest guy that we think he is, and that's in her relationship and her life, that's what was the thing that had to give. It was her marriage. And so Penny Ramsey, seems to have given up nothing. But the interesting thing, I think, that they also brought Penny Ramsey in. So she's the working mom, and her and Amy start having a relationship, and Amy's the non-working mom. And through her relationship with Penny, Amy starts to realize, wait, this woman isn't judging me because I'm staying home. And she immediately thought that this woman would judge her for what she did with her day. And she realizes, wow, she's really not questioning what I do all day. And I think what's interesting about that is that sometimes, there's one section that talks about, like, basically posing the question, who made up this tension between working and non-working mothers? Was it the media? Is it mothers, brawling after school? I mean, what really is going on? And I think it's interesting if you're a mom, like out of my group of mom friends, there's a pretty good mix of us who are working and who are not working. We have a lawyer, we have a doctor, we have teachers, we have social workers. There's we have an international banker. Like, there's a lot of women in my life who do a lot of different things. And when you really talk to people, even if you think they have a judgment about you, when you really talk to them, especially if they're your friend, they really don't. They have better things to do with their time than sit back and say, oh, Kara, what does she do all day? Eat bonbons and take naps? Like, I don't think anybody's really thinking that about me when you talk about it. And you realize, too, like, what a personal decision it is. One of my best friends works part-time and has been very honest with the fact that to be a good mom, this is what she needs to do. Because she feels like if she was home all day, she wouldn't be a good mom. She wouldn't be together for her children. So the thing that makes her a good mom is to do a little bit of both. She really loves what she does, and she loves to work, and when she picks her kids up every day, she feels like she's a better person for it. And I really applaud her for that, and really applaud the honesty which I think sometimes we are quick to pass judgment, and you think, oh, that person just went back to work because they wanted to make more money. Well, that's not always the case. Or, oh, that person wanted to stay home because she no longer has ambition. There's very simple things we can say, but it never seems to be really what's going on. And I think that's what Penny really shows us, is that we never really know what's going on with a person until you kind of really get in there and get to know their lives. So you don't really know that she's really unhappy with her marriage, and that she started having an affair with, sounds like a very cute Englishman, but that's not necessarily what's going to fulfill her either, and that eventually she ends up getting, I never gets found out by her husband, everybody else knows, which I'm not sure if that's a very good thing, but that Penny kind of shows that we can't have it all, and that something eventually has to give. And all of the women by the end of the book kind of come to some kind of reconciliation with the whole work, non-work thing. Amy returns to work at a law office at a very general practice that's not specific. She's not passionate about it. She doesn't really love it, but she has to because they've gotten themselves into a financial situation that they can't get out of, because her husband kind of took over the finances, and she didn't really know what was going on, and they went on this really exclusive vacation that put them into debt because he thought that's what she wanted. He thought she wanted to have, this life. And so she ends up having to go back to work because they're in pretty serious debt. Jill decides to kind of focus on Nadia, that's kind of going to be her purpose, what she does. Roberta kind of revives an old passion. She was, in her heyday, really involved with reproductive rights organizations like Planned Parenthood and places like that. So she actually finds a clinic in Harlem that she starts to volunteer with, and then eventually the part-time becomes full-time, full-time volunteer becomes full-time work. And so she's involved with something else, but she never goes back to painting, which I think is interesting. And Karen keeps going to interviews waiting for the right fit, which I like Karen, It'd be nice to, I don't know how many times any of you have gone to an interview and been like, I don't know if they're going to work for me. You're usually like, please call me. So I think that it was interesting. But what I feel like I can take away from this book is that, mothering, parenting is a very private, how you mother, how you parent sometimes can be a very private thing, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I think that it's a very complex thing, and it can be very difficult, but I think that parents, you really need to surround themselves with other moms, with other people of different generations, with people with different lifestyles. Like the other night, I ran into friends at Barnes & Noble, two of our friends who we used to teach with, who are single, and they came over. We ended up talking until 12 o'clock at night about politics. And it was great because I felt like I used my brain in another way, that if that would have been, my friend's friends of mine who have kids, first of all, we wouldn't have been up till 12. And second of all, it might have revolved around peanut butter sandwiches, which is not a bad thing to talk about, but it was really nice to talk about, things that are not a part of my everyday, or that it wasn't talking about parenting strategies or, what we're going to do that weekend and all those things. That's an important part of my life too. But it's nice to kind of be reminded that there's other things going on and that I can be involved in them and that I have worthwhile things to say as a mother, because I have a very different perspective, because my perspective is all about these little people and how is, our change in government going to affect my little people in, 20 years. That I think, they really talk about, don't give up on your passions or your dreams, that you kind of have to reconcile the work or non-work thing for yourself, whether you decide to not work or whether you decide to work, that somehow you have to reconcile that and figure, am I at peace with this? Am I okay with it? And if you're not, to keep digging until you get to a point. And I'm not sure I'm there. I do a little bit here and there, but even this week, I said earlier, I was just I can't do this. This is too much for me. My personality, I might not have been a good working mother. I think this fits me. That it's really good to hear other people's stories before you pass any kind of judgment or before you draw conclusions about what you think their life is like. To be confident with your own choices. And I think it's interesting that most of this book revolves around women, but in the last chapter, they pull out the stay-at-home dad, which I thought was good, but they give the stay-at-home dad the Hallmark moment, the moment where you go, wow, that was good. And they give it to the dad, which is, ironic and kind of funny. But this dad basically says he's walking around the school on this safety duty that all the parents for this one private school had to do. They're walking around the school, and his thought was, if you long for what you do not have, you will be one of those unhappy people you can find anywhere in any setting. The ones who can't appreciate what they have as long as they see something they cannot have. So basically the grass is always greener concept, And so as a mom, some days I look at my husband and go, oh, you're so lucky you get to get out the door and go to work. And he probably looks at me and goes, wow, you're so lucky you get to stay home. Which this morning he took the day off today so I wouldn't have to worry about the kids, which is very nice of him. But I think he was he was having one of the mornings I have where everybody was cranky and crying, and one of the kids Sammy was in his crib screaming his brains out. Hella was in her bedroom crying her eyes out. And he's like, I just couldn't deal with them both at the same time. I had to put one of them away. And I'm trying to get ready, and I'm like, is this the break that I needed or not? It's just funny how life is, And so I'm sure today he was like, is it time for me to go to work yet? And I was going, is it time for you to leave for work yet? Because you're messing up my schedule. But I think it really comes down to, what can make you happy. If you're a happier mom and better for your kids if you work, then sometimes that's a choice you have to make. If you're a happier mom because you get to be home, then, that's the choice you have to make. But I think what some people forget to do is to look at it thoughtfully pre-children. So when you're not in the midst of it, to make a decision, try to think about it a little bit before you decide to have kids, because once you're in there, it can be hard to think about other things clearly. But I think that it really comes down to what your personal choices are. So overall, I have to say that I liked, Meg Wolitzer after it. It was definitely a love-hate relationship at first with this book, but by the end of it, and even talking kind of today, I just realized that I really do appreciate the things that it made me think about, and I appreciate the discussions I think I'm going to start having with my friends, just because I haven't thought about starting a book group about this book. I thought I should just email all my girlfriends and be like, hey, let's have a book talk. Let's do this. Just because I'm interested in seeing what they have to say, because Joe said a lot of the buzz over the summer was about this issue and just about the book, and that you kind of wonder how the women closest to you reconcile, because even though you talk about it a little bit, if you kind of don't make it a purpose to talk about it, it doesn't always happen. So I think I'd like to do that. And I think that concludes what I wanted to say.
Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.